Great picture you found of me online there, John. That was my mom's favorite, too. Good morning, my name is Peter. I'm a grateful, recovering intellectual. I used to think I knew some things, and now I just love the mystery. And this is a great place to be this morning. I'm so flattered and honored again. I don't know why y'all keep bringing me back here, but I love it, love it, love it. So thank you so much. It's a fantastic place to be, and you're all in the right place. So my talk today is called Your Greatest Treasures. And normally when we think of the word treasure, we think of great wealth, Trump-like wealth, or maybe great piles of pirate booty, or some sort of sack of uncut diamonds in a James Bond movie. I don't know. Treasure is a funny word, but upon deeper reflection, of course, we realize that it is in our loved ones, our children, and our family, our spouses, and that's our real treasure, and we know that that's where the real pricelessness resides. But in the ancient Chinese wisdom text, the Tao Te Ching, there's a very different definition of treasure. In chapter 67 of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu wrote, "I have just three things to teach: simplicity, patience, compassion. These are your greatest treasures." So this morning, I think I want to think with you a little bit deeper into why is it that those three qualities, those three virtues, simplicity, patience, and compassion, are in fact our greatest treasures. Let's explore that and see if that isn't true. So we're turning the clock back to 600 BCE in ancient China, 25 centuries ago. And there, an elderly archivist or librarian called Lao Tzu had grown weary of humanity's unwillingness to cultivate its own virtue. And he decided, I'm going to go live in the mountains by myself for the rest of my life. Solitude. And I know we've all had those kind of weeks. And so the story goes that he got on his donkey and he rode off into the mountains. And at the mountain pass, the gatekeeper there stopped him and said, "Lao Tzu, before you disappear into the woods forever, would you stop and write down some of your wisdom for us?" And he said, "No." He said, "I don't have any wisdom, and if I did, I wouldn't know how to write it down." But luckily for us, the gatekeeper was insistent and wore him down. So the story goes, Lao Tzu sat in the gatekeeper's hut for 3 days and wrote this 5,000 character, 81 little poem book called the Tao Te Ching. It's one of the most wonderful origin stories of all the great wisdom texts in the world. I mean, it almost didn't get written, and it was written very reluctantly, and you can feel the reluctance in the first line. The first line says, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao." And so there's that ineffability piece. There's that piece that the Tao, which is the Chinese word for the way, the one, the nameless source of being, what in the Western religions gets personified as the deity, Allah, Yahweh, the Father. But in Taoism, there's no personification of this first principle. It's just called Tao. Perfect religion for atheists and everybody else. So this Tao is, of course, the conscious aliveness of being itself. It's very much what George Lucas calls the Force. And that's because Lucas, and he admits this in interviews, just pulled the Tao right into his fictional Star Wars Jedi religion. So when Luke Skywalker in the first film, now annoyingly called Episode 4, asks Obi-Wan Kenobi, "What is the Force?" Obi-Wan says, well, and I'm paraphrasing here, the Force is a conscious aliveness that animates all reality. So you could say, for you theologians in the room, you could say this is a kind of pantheism or panentheism. If those words confuse you, just move on. We don't. There's that intellectual thing creeping back in again. But anyway, the Tao is this remarkable idea, very much like Brahman in Vedanta philosophy and very much like Spinoza's God. But it's also very much like Paul's the Christ within. And when Paul says in his letters in the New Testament that we are all one in Christ, there is no male and female, no Gentile, no Jew, and I'll add more. No rich, no poor, no gay, no or straight, or there's no gender, there's no political party. When we meet in Christ consciousness, all of those sociological and genetic distinctions dissolve. So that's the oneness of the Tao. And therefore, in that Taoist system, wisdom is called Wu Wei. Wisdom is learning how to move spontaneously in accord with the Tao. So if the Tao is the great unfolding that is always occurring, then our ideal human action is not to impose a kind of egoic agenda onto the uncarved wholeness of the world, but to instead learn how to move within what is already unfolding. In the way that a surfer paddling out into the waves does not control the waves. She sits and waits. And when a wave begins to rise on the horizon, she moves into position. The goal is to put her intention and her action into accord with what it already is unfolding. It's a very different kind of action than simply imposing your will onto the world. So it's deeply cooperative. So Taoist wisdom then can best be described, I suppose, as intuitive naturalness. Now I want to read to you the entire text of chapter 67 from the Tao Te Ching. It's very short, but I want you to hear the whole thing, and then we'll get into those three words and see if we can recognize them in our own excellence, in our own virtue. Chapter 67 goes like this. Some say that my teaching is nonsense. Others call it lofty but impractical. But to those who have looked inside themselves, this nonsense makes perfect sense. And to those who put it into practice, this loftiness has roots that go deep. I have just three things to teach: patience, simplicity, and compassion. These three are your greatest treasures. Simple in actions and in thoughts, you return to the source of being. Patient with both friends and enemies, you accord with the way things are. Compassionate toward yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world. So he doesn't just sort of give you a list of simplicity, patience, and compassion. He points a path toward those three virtues. And let's look at those three paths. Let's begin with simplicity. Again, he said, simple in actions and in thoughts, you return to the source of being. So, how does practicing simplicity move us closer to the source of being? Well, it's simple. The more, think about it, you don't hear anything new in these talks of mine. This is all just remember this. Oh yeah, remember that. So remember this, that the more complicated our lives become, the more buried we are under layers and layers of adornment and intricacy, the further we move from our own essence. There's a sense in which my busyness creates a kind of chaotic distortion that I then become trapped in the same way that an insect gets wrapped in spider web. And it muffles my ears, and it clouds my eyes, and it confounds my mind, and I move more and more out of touch with what is. And I live more and more in the isolation of my own intellectual architecture, with all of its elaborate judgments and worries and opinions. So all of this busyness then sets up a screen through which we then try to view the uncarved wholeness of the world. But everything's cloudy now. Everything's distant. Everything's removed. We end up isolated in a thicket of our own judgments. The real world, the essential world, other people, they recede into the haze. So complexity is the disease, and simplicity is the antidote. And as Lao Tzu says in another chapter, in the pursuit of knowledge, every day something is added. And in the practice of the Tao, every day something is dropped. I'm reminded of that wonderful Zen saying again, don't seek enlightenment, just get rid of all your opinions. So that's a quick look at simplicity. Let's think about patience now for a moment. He says, patient with both friends and enemies, you accord with the way things are. So how does practicing patience put us into accord with the way things are? So when I think of patience, I think of two other words, renunciation and non-attachment. And we get those teachings from, respectively, Hinduism and Buddhism. In the Hindu tradition or in Vedanta philosophy, we hear a lot about renunciation. Gandhi talked about it a lot. It means letting go. It means letting go of our illusion of control. And it is essential in Vedanta to practice renunciation in order to realize or make real or embody our oneness with Brahman or the Tao. Gandhi was asked by a journalist once, what's your philosophy of life in 3 words? And Gandhi said, renounce and enjoy. And when we renounce, we let go of that strange fantasy that we're in charge. And then you get to enjoy your life because you no longer feel so like everything's a struggle. And in the Buddhist tradition, again, that non-attachment word kind of holds that same place. Buddha taught non-attachment as the supreme method for moving out of ego mind and into awakened consciousness, dropping our endless list of demands and expectations and practicing instead this deep acceptance of what is. So whether you call it renunciation or non-attachment, I think that's what Lao Tzu is pointing at with his simpler idea of patience. Because when you're patient, you simply are okay with the way things are right now. And you know that what's coming is coming. And what's not coming is not coming. And there's a surrender to that. There's a Zen Buddhist teacher working today, a wonderful guy called John Tarrant, and he puts it this way. He says, suffering is the phrase, not this. And awakening is the phrase, what is this? Do you feel the different energies? This, you're stuck in traffic and you're like, no, not this. Or you get a latte and it's not quite right. Like, no, not this. So whatever it is, from the ridiculous to the sublime, that constant consciousness of judgment, rejection, struggle, the compulsive need to go around correcting everything and everyone, the way other people drive is a big concern to you. You have a lot to say about it in your mind. Even if no one's in the car, you're probably talking about it. And it's weird. Why don't you just go around? It's none of your business how other people drive. You insist on your own freedom and you refuse to grant that right to anyone else. Did you notice that? I'm talking to myself here. I'm not accusing anybody. 1 finger pointed at you, 3 back at me, all that, right? So, yeah. So patience then, I think, is Lao Tzu's word for that state of serenity where one is content in the now moment and not caught by the snare of craving for something else. Because when you are free of expectations, the pace at which things unfold is exactly the right pace. And by the way, he's very specific about where that patience should be aimed, isn't he? He said, toward our friends and enemies. Because, of course, it is in our human relationships that our serenity is most sorely tested. So, again, instead of demanding that all other people on earth obey my arbitrary expectations, that they talk the way I think they should talk, and think the way I think they should think, and act the way I think they should act. I've got a point of view on all of what y'all should be doing all the time. And that's hell. You just created hell for yourself. To live in that kind of endless, tedious futility. Because you don't get to control what anybody else says, does, or thinks. So you just bought yourself an impossible nightmare. And this is especially true when it comes to our enemies. Friends is one thing. You cut them some slack. But our enemies, the people we are in conflict with. I think the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow put it best when he said, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man's life sorrow enough to disarm all hostility. What a wonderful description of empathy. If we could read the secret histories of our enemies, kind of know how they got there, we should find in each man's life sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostilities. We know that the challenging people in our lives, the people who we are at odds with, they're not that different from us. And this is why Jesus, of course, in this famous saying, love your enemies. I think what he really means is there's no such thing as an enemy. Because if he's commanding us to love our enemies, and that's what we're already doing with our friends, then he just blew up the distinction between friends and enemies. There are no enemies. There are just other people suffering like us, working with incomplete information like us, clouded by storms of chaotic emotions like us, trying to make their way through this difficult world like us, sometimes saying horrible things and acting in confusingly destructive ways like us. So patience is, of course, if you want to build that patience muscle, work on it with your relationships first. Then you can be patient with the moon and the sun and all the critters and stuff much more simply. One more piece on patience. In chapter 15 of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu wrote, "Do you have the patience to wait until your mud settles and the water is clear?" That's a nice metaphor. Chinese philosophy is a little different than Greek philosophy. There aren't a lot of logical syllogisms. It's just metaphor after metaphor after metaphor after metaphor. Let's look at that one a little more closely. Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? So imagine a glass of water with a spoonful of dirt in it. And it's all stirred up so the water is opaque. You can't see through it. And you're thinking, boy, I wish I had more clarity. And so Lao Tzu suggests you set it on the table and stop touching it. And wait. But when I have a problem in my life, I just keep stirring. Maybe if I move this over here, and then I wonder why I have no clarity and why solutions never appear. So I have that one on my refrigerator. Do you have the patience to wait till your mud settles and the water is clear? And then chapter 64, he hits that same theme. I know you've experienced this. Rushing into action, you fail. Trying to grasp things, you lose them. Forcing a project to completion, you ruin what was almost ripe. The virtue here is the same, working with what is. You don't make the peaches on your peach tree ripen faster and grow sweeter by going out every day and yelling at it or squeezing it. It's going to happen when it happens. So that's simplicity and that's patience. Those are the first two. Let's go to the third one, compassion. Lao Tzu wrote, "Compassionate toward yourself, you reconcile all beings in the world." First thing I notice is he's not commanding you to love others. The first job is self-compassion. Charity begins at home and love begins in here. If you cannot experience love, mercy, and forgiveness toward yourself, then how can you offer that to anyone else? if you can't experience love, mercy, and forgiveness toward yourself, then the love, mercy, and forgiveness you claim to be giving to others is partial, incomplete, clouded with ego smoke. Is it really love, or do you just want something? No one can tell. They can't tell. You can't tell. It's a mess. But when you cultivate self-compassion, this leads directly, Lao Tzu says, to the reconciliation of all beings in the world. That's quite a heady claim. But when you learn how to love yourself better, your love for others grows clearer, purer, and more genuinely nurturing, more authentic. But still, I still don't see, how does self-love, and by the way, notice the resistance you feel when we even think about this. Notice how default our position is of self-loathing, of self-criticism, that I'm not good enough, that I'm not whole, I'm not perfect, I'm not ready, I'm not smart enough, I'm not clean enough, I'm not talented enough, I'm too this, I'm too that. That's the default. So when you hear people talk about you should love yourself, I bet you have a critical voice that comes up and says, no, that's narcissism. I don't want to be like, I almost said Donald Trump. I want to leave him out. I want to leave him out of this. I guess I should just get used to saying President Trump. So, that's just going to get my head, Yeah. Oh, okay. Now, how does that make the Trump supporters in the room feel when you all moan and groan like that? Come on. One may have wandered in here by mistake, Oh my gosh. Now I'm thinking about Trump. You know what? He after the Republican debate the other night, which I watched with great fascination, 3 hours of that, and Donald Trump actually appeared in my dream that night. I know. I don't remember what he just popped up and said something. Who knows what? But it was fascinating. So, okay. When I go on a tangent, I go all the way. So, I have no idea what we're talking about. Where am I? No, we were thinking about this challenge of trying to understand self-love and self-compassion as a positive, virtuous thing, and not as a kind of narcissism and self-centeredness and egocentrism. So many of us in our spiritual work, you all recognize this. We get caught up in this kind of weird idea of like must annihilate ego, must annihilate self bad, and as Deepak Chopra says. The obsession with the annihilation of the ego is the ego's favorite game. That's rich. So, maybe we can relax a little bit. So this is kind of a tall order, though. How does self-love lead to the reconciliation of all the other beings in the world? That sounds like a big job. I can't even get my family to get along. And now I'm supposed to love myself so much that everybody else falls into a status of peace. But, here's how it works. Taoism is not a program. It's not a legislative agenda. It's not an NGO. It's not some organization. Taoism is a simple, starts right here, almost solitary practice. And we all know this, that the microcosm is the same as the macrocosm. And many of us experience this already deeply in our spiritual work. That we know that our spiritual awakening is our greatest contribution to world peace. Let me put it more pointedly. Your spiritual awakening is your single most greatest contribution to world peace. It's not selfish to work on yourself. We know this. When one person shows up awake, the whole room changes. It reminds me of Gandhi's idea of zones of peace, to use a more contemporary example. This is how Gandhi would put it. I can't do anything about Syria today. But I can vow in my life in my zone of peace, in my zone of influence around me, the roads I drive my car on, the emails I will write back today, the way I walk into every room, the way I deal with shopkeepers and baristas and everybody else I'm going to interact with, I can vow in my sphere of influence to not deceive anyone, to not manipulate anyone, to treat all beings as beings of infinite value, to ask not what's in it for me, but what is the right thing to do. And I can make that vow every day that it's absolutely safe for you to move through my sphere. Now, no one else in my sphere might be practicing this. Again, I'm not controlling anything. But I vow every day to make this zone of peace around me. Gandhi suggests that this is what peace really means. You know that famous line, be the change you want to see in the world. So if you're interested in peace, how about stop being angry all the time? How about coming out of your constant judgment of everybody else? How about learning how to see your enemies differently? That's what peace really means. And then we can more powerfully work on our social justice political programs, because I'm a pretty political person. I don't know where you are on that spectrum, but it matters to me a lot, and I say a lot, and I do a lot, and but I try not to get personal, right? So, but when we make this self-love pact, we just show up differently, even in our political arguments. And that's this knowledge then that we know that we're doing enough. Because I can't fix the world, but it's how I show up is the most powerful thing. So in this Taoist view, these things we're thinking about today, there's almost, it's so simple, there's almost nothing there. Not really offering you any new teaching today, a new ideology. I have no new method for you today, no set of practices today. It reminds me of the great 20th century teacher, Krishnamurti, who often sort of tore up all the ideologies, tore up all the methods. No guru, no methods, no practices. Because if you cling to methods, then there's still a part of you outside of that agenda. This is about embodiment. This is about becoming who we really are, not just tacking on another ideological overlay that we sometimes practice and sometimes don't. So that's a kind of provocative way. That he was a good teacher because he really challenged a lot of cherished ideas in so-called spirituality. He would say, Krishnamurti said, if you refer to yourself as a Muslim, as a Christian, as a Jew, as a Hindu, as a Canadian, as a Democrat, you are committing an act of violence. That's a pretty provocative thing to say, because he said you are setting yourself apart from the whole of the interconnected one, and inevitably, even though you deny it, inevitably there is an elitism there. Your group is just a little bit, sweeter than the rest. And so in Krishnamurti's view, that's what simplicity means. But we cannot do it alone, so we have to help each other, and we have to be genuine, and we have to be quick to forgive, and we have to be merciful, especially toward ourselves. And let us always try to recognize in the failings of others our own weaknesses and our own incompletion. As Thich Nhat Hanh and many others have taught, there is no way to peace. Peace is the way. As Gandhi said, it's all about the means. Don't worry about the end, Gandhi said. The end he called sat or satya in Sanskrit. It means truth or being. It's all there is. It's what we teach here. There's only one power and presence. God is, and to put it in theistic terms, God is either in charge or he's not. And if he's not, we're all on our own. And if he is, why worry? And those are your two choices. If you're living in anxiety, fear, and terror all the time, you need a bigger God. Or again, for the agnostics and atheists in the room, let's not talk about God. Let's talk about Tao. Let's talk about the force. I don't care. But there is this sense in which everything is okay, or we live in an abyss of nihilistic meaninglessness. And I don't know if there's middle ground there. I just don't know. So let us close with these words from chapter 67. Some say that my teaching is nonsense. Others call it lofty but impractical. But to those that have looked inside themselves, this nonsense makes perfect sense. And to those who put it into practice, this loftiness has roots that go deep. So may the roots of simplicity, patience, and compassion go deep within you. Namaste. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much.